Good evening, and welcome to our Author Talk with Sara Ackerman. This year marks the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, and the Hawaii State Public Library System has partnered with the 75th Anniversary Commemoration Committee to highlight this historic moment. We have events like Author Talks, as well as some awesome digital collection with activities available through the month of August. Check out our website. And that's what brings us here tonight. My name is Cheryl Lynch, and I'm a librarian at the Waianae branch of the Hawaii State Public Library System. Tonight, we'll be talking with local author Sara Ackerman. Welcome, Sara, and thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, great. You have written 3 books set in Hawaii during World War II, Red Sky Over Hawaii, The Lieutenant's Nurse, and The Island of Sweet Pies and Soldiers. These books are historical fiction in which the home front is the setting. Your books show Hawaii's unique challenges to the war, given our large population of Japanese. Tell us how your background allowed you to so beautifully capture these challenges.
Thank you. Well, I was born and raised in Hawaii, and my grandparents actually were here during the war, and my grandfather was a principal at Honokaa School, and my grandmother was a teacher there. And so when I was growing up, I was really raised on their stories of World War II. On the weekends, they had the soldiers camping out in their living room. And these were the Marines that were on the Big Island to train for Iwo Jima. Essentially, there was a couple rounds of Marines there. And so my grandma, she was a great storyteller. She was an English teacher and a typing teacher. And the war and these soldiers, as they called them, even though they're Marines, I know Marines don't always like to be called soldiers, but it really stuck with her, even until she was, an old woman in the nursing home. She would always talk about the war. And so I grew up on these stories. And I think as a young girl, it's just, especially stories of the lion in my first book, that was kind of the spark of inspiration. The Marines had a lion that they brought with them that was the mascot. And so that really stuck with me. And so when I started writing books, I had all this to draw from. And so, yeah, that's kind of what got me started.
Well, thanks for mentioning Roscoe, because that was one thing I was wondering about, whether that was true or not. So that's fun. Well, peace, prosperity, and progress is the theme of the 75th Anniversary Commemoration Committee, and your books fit that theme so well. Your characters pursue peace, prosperity, and progress on the home front. And what are some of the ways you were able to portray these values and attitudes in these novels?
Well, I think that one of the main things that I wanted to portray was neighbors and friends and family taking care of each other, because though, Hawaii we were in the midst of the war. And so though maybe they weren't on the battlefront, or they were definitely affected, their lives were affected, and how neighbors stood up for each other when, for those that couldn't, they had each other's backs for the most part. And so I think that was kind of one of the main things is how the people held each other up during this very dark time, which I think is a bit relevant to what, there's a connection, I think, to what we're going through right now with holding up your neighbor. And then just progress. I think we have a ways to go, but progress towards peace, avoiding wars when we can, because you see the destruction and the toll that takes on individuals and families and communities.
Yeah, and the prosperity, I found it very fun in Island of Sweet Pie and Soldiers, how they were looking for ways to augment their income, but still try to support the soldiers. And they came up with that cute little pie thing. I had to go make a pie myself after reading that book.
I know, definitely. The comfort of home cooked meals. I think that really was, those kind of things go a long way for an 18-year-old boy that's, that's halfway across the world from home and maybe sailing off never to return.
Yeah. And trying something new from the local community because they were making sweet potato pie with those purple potatoes, which I think a lot of them had never seen before.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then they were so delicious, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Well, where do you get your ideas for your books?
Well, like I said, so I have a lot of ideas from my grandmother. My first book was, the Roscoe the lion mascot was my spark for the idea, and then kind of the women banding together. And then my grandmother also did come over on the Lurleen, and my grandfather brought her over or sent her a ticket. And so that's kind of was the idea for my second book, The Lieutenant's Nurse, which is the nurse that comes over. And so that was also an idea for my grandmother, who also did kind of fall for another man on the ship, but she ended up with my grandfather. So a lot of the little details, like in my first book, there's a scene where the women are taken in because they're suspected of possibly doing spy work, because they think they're sending flashing lights from their house, but it turned out to be something else. And so that was a true story. They didn't spend the night in jail, but those kind of things I have pretty much in my memory from my grandmother. Also, for my third book, Red Sky Over Hawaii, I spend a lot of time at the volcano. I've been going there my whole life, and I do a lot of hiking and exploring. And so for that book, I was out hiking and I stumbled upon that house, the Idaho house that was built by shipmen in case of an invasion, because everyone did believe that the Japanese were going to invade. After the attack, people were sure that we were going to be invaded. And even before the attack, I think people knew that something was going to happen. And so he had built this out in the boonies. And when I found it, I didn't know what it was at the time. I just thought it was this really cool old house down Chain of Craters Road. And then when I looked into it, saw that it's, part of the national park, historic houses, and what it was built for, a little light bulb went on. I need to write a story about this. And another place I often get ideas is like at book clubs or book talks. People will come up and say, hey, my friend's mother was like, for example, my friend's mother was a German girl during the war, and her parents were taken away. So that was just, someone came up and talked to me about that, and that's how that also ended up in Sky Over Hawaii. So
so cool.
Yeah, talking to people.
So do you find that balancing fact and fiction when you write historical fiction is tricky?
I find it pretty tricky in terms of World War II, especially. You've got this very strict timeline that you can't deviate from. So making the story fit within those parameters can be really hard. And also just always having to look up stuff or call my mom or call my, a family friend and, hey, did you eat this back then? Did you, what were you driving? Did you have a refrigerator? Was there ice cream? All that kind of stuff can be, it just takes more time. But with each subsequent book, I feel like I know a little bit more, and that helps. And also, I have a place and I kind of a backdrop of World War II, and I'm creating my own stories and putting that in. So it can be a lot of work. Yeah. It's more challenging than, I say, just writing complete fiction.
Have you ever had anyone ever say something about one of the fictitious characters you make up and say, oh, that sounds so familiar, or something like that?
I think maybe when I was writing about the sheriff in my first book, somebody said, and I think I kind of just made up the last name, but I think there really was a sheriff with that last name, but it was a common last name in that town. So yeah, that kind of thing. Yeah, I've always wondered about that.
I think it's fun for people when they read a historical fiction to see if they can uncover something that would pique their interest or something they'd have a connection with. It's just fun,
Right.
even though it might not be true. It's a fun part about reading historical fiction. So
Mhm.
especially from a place that where you live, like your books here set in Hawaii, where they were so much fun to read. I completely enjoyed them, and I've just started a lieutenant's nurse. And now that you said that little bit about your grandmother and your grandfather, that makes it even more interesting and fun. That's what's nice about author talks. You get those little inside tidbits.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I can talk
So,
all day.
well, you share some really interesting and fun facts about Hawaii. You've mentioned some already. One of the things that you talk about in several of your books are the Paniolos. So can you tell us, do you have a connection with the Paniolos, or do you just find them as romantic and intriguing as I do?
I think that, yeah, I don't have a real close connection, but my dad's parents actually, my dad's dad was from South Kona, and then when I grew up, they lived in Waimea, and so I'd spend holidays and summers and everything in Waimea, and just walking around town. We'd always go horseback riding in Parker Ranch, and yeah, I was just very enamored with it all. It's so beautiful. I love horses, even though I'm not an expert rider. I would ride when I was young. I had friends up there with horses, so it was just a real admiration of them.
Yeah. Well, actually coming up this Saturday right here on Facebook Live is the author David Woolman, and he wrote Aloha Rodeo. Did
Yeah.
you get a chance to read Aloha Rodeo?
Oh, but I have it, and it's funny
Ah,
because when I was leaving my job at HPA to come over here to Oahu, we just picked his book as a school-wide read for this coming year, and so I
hmm.
got in touch with him. And then the pandemic struck, and he's like, "Hey, do you think HPA might have room for my kids?" And so he ended up actually moving to HPA, or I mean, they moved to Waimea, and he's now possibly working at HPA part time. I'm not sure, but I was like, "Oh, you could teach the novel writing class that I just left." But
Oh, how fun.
so I hope to
Yeah.
meet him one of these days.
Well, if our audience is interested in Paniolo and their history, the Aloha Rodeo is a super fun, super interesting history, not historical fiction, but actual fiction, I mean, actual history, nonfiction about these intriguing romantic. I say romantic because you romanticize them in your books. I think it was a lot of hard work, but
Yes.
they can participate, and you and I can too. We'll check out our uh, uh, Mr. Woman on Saturday. I think it's at 10 o'clock. Yeah.
Okay.
So you feature animals a lot in your books. You mentioned Roscoe the lion. There's Ohello the horse. There's Akala. Is that how you say his name? The pig.
Mhm.
Love that pig. And Brownie the chicken. Do you have a special affinity? Your character, I know Ella, um, and also who was the other one? Emma?
Coco in
Oh,
the
Coco. Yeah, they have a real affinity with animals, and that's a real appealing part of your books as well. Do you feel like you have a special affinity with animals?
Yes, definitely. I love animals. I can't imagine my life without them. And so I just, and as I'm writing, I'll usually have an idea about what kind of main kind of animal, main character I want to have. But then sometimes other ones just pop up, just like characters, and it's always really fun. Like the pig, he just showed up, or the featherless chicken. And often it's just things I'm seeing out in the world around me, and they just walk onto the pages. But I think one of my favorite animals is Sailor, the Great Dane in Red Sky over Hawaii, and she was an actual dog that I followed on Instagram because I had a Great
Ah,
Dane when I was growing up, and I love Great Danes, and she was so cute. And her mom does kind of bookstagram posts with her dog with books, and
hmm.
So I was connected with them, and I just love this Great Dane. And I said, hey, you know, I need a dog in my next book. Can I kind of write her into my book? And she was so cute. And then partway through writing it, she passed away. And so I was just heartbroken.
Mm.
But they said, you know, keep writing her. And so she kind of is memorialized in this book. And she was such a big help to the girl, you know, to Coco.
Yeah.
Because I'm pretty big on therapy animals, as you'll see when you read The Lieutenant's Nurse as well.
Oh, great. Okay, I'm looking forward to that. Yeah, your animals seem to, your animal characters in your novels just have such a huge part in the stories. You know, they're so important. And anybody that's an animal lover, I think that's another thing about your books that's so appealing, is the importance you put on the animals in there. And they're so touching. On a more serious note, not that animals aren't they're seriously cute and fun, but cross-cultural relationships. So in two of your novels, the main character is a woman who's moved to Hawaii from the Midwest. These women enable the reader, myself, the reader, to see the special multicultural nature of the islands, because they're outsiders coming in, so they get a fresh view of this. During World War II, this was extremely important. And recently we had an author talk with Tom Kaufman and about his book, How Hawaii Changed America. And he pointed out the importance of friendliness as a power for change. You do an excellent job of conveying this idea in your books. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I think it goes along with what I said earlier, where, you know, I think Hawaii is just we're a mixed bag. You know, we've got so many different cultures and people. And for the most part, we all, you know, we get along, and people are, you know, they kind of jokingly tease each other, but still, you know, get along. And my grandmother, when they were living on the Big Island, she had, you know, a lot of Japanese friends, and she had a Japanese maid that helped, you know, help with the kids and the friends and teachers. And so I was raised, you know, hearing about that. And then in my school, you know, there was more Japanese in Howleys, and, you know, I always just admired them. And, you know, so, and it was just sort of part of my upbringing, you know, is just being around a bunch of different cultures. And then also, like, my uncle, I think he was the only Howley kid at the Japanese school in Honoka. And so that was kind of my inspiration for that as well. But I think friendliness, like I said, my grandmother, my grandparents, they housed all these Marines. And I think they were helping them as well kind of see, they were into the culture, you know, they're giving them a window into how it is in Hawaii, where it was very different from where they came from. And, you know, that we were attacked by the Japanese from Japan. These people in Hawaii, you know, a lot of them, they were citizens, and they were, you know, they were all just part of the community. Mm-hmm. And so I think that in the book, I wanted to portray that. Mm-hmm. And just, like I said, people lifting up people.
Yeah. Well, in the one story, you have a character that is very much, he's one of the characters that's from the islands, but he is very unfriendly and causes a lot of trouble for his Japanese neighbors. And I like that you put that in there, because it helps everybody. I mean, it helps the reader see that even though, I mean, they're still prejudiced against the people, even from those people that they live with them, and they knew their neighbors. They let that war scare and all the war talk influence them. And I think you did a great job of including that in your story to help give it a full perspective. And I really like that. Well, we had a question over here in our chat from Jessica, and she says, if you were able to see one of your books on the big screen. Which one do you think would be your choice? And maybe do a little casting for us. What do you think?
Oh my goodness. I love this question, and it's always so hard because I'm like, which one would I love to see on the big screen? I kind of think they would all be great movies, but in a way, maybe the first one, because I feel like The Lion and Waipio Valley and just, it's more of a, maybe it's well-rounded Hawaii and the soldiers, whereas the Volcano Red Sky is more just volcano. And then the other one is just more like primarily on the ship and then at Pearl Harbor and Tripler. So I think maybe my first one. And then casting it would be so hard because I'm pretty out of the loop with actors and actresses. They'd be way too old to be cast as the main characters. I always loved like Scarlett Johansson. I think she'd be a great Violet.
Oh, yeah. Good. Yeah, I agree.
Or she might be a better Jean, actually, but I really always loved her. And then for men, goodness, that's going to be a hard one. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm in a period of liking Bradley Cooper as an actor. But yeah, to look into it.
So fun. Yeah, I can just, you'd have to, I was wondering, what are you doing? What are you working on? Do you have something that's coming out next, or are you almost finished? Where do you stand with your next book? I'm all excited.
I have a fourth book and a fifth book in contract. And so the fourth book is written and it's with my editor right now. And so hoping that she loves it. My agent loved it, but it needs a lot of work still. But it is about the women's air raid defense. Are you familiar with that?
No.
Okay, so just after Pearl Harbor, they were a top secret group of women organized to work the radar. And essentially they were like air traffic controllers. So they were at Fort Shafter doing this top secret work, and they were called wards, Women's Air Raid Defense. And it's really actually fascinating. There's a book called Shuffleboard Pilots, which I got all of my research from because there's not a whole lot about these women. But it's a very, very, very interesting story, their whole history. And so right now the working title is Radar Girls. And yeah, so that's supposed to come out next summer.
Fun. Fort Shafter, they filmed the Pearl Harbor there, and they have so maybe that one will be a big screen one. And Fort Shafter is very historic and it's been featured on some movies already. It's a very interesting place.
It would be, and it's kind of in between. So it takes place December 7th through Midway. That's the time frame. So these women were helping plot and guide the pilots into blacked out airfields and through Midway, and it's really fascinating. There's women on all islands doing it. Yeah.
So how'd you find out about this topic?
I discovered it when I was researching for my second book, and I just, I always make a note of future ideas.
Mm-hmm.
My fifth book, I just came up with a possible idea. It may or may not be World War II, but we'll see.
Well, that's so cool. Well, as I mentioned in the introduction to this, Danielle actually, with Library Development Services, curated a digital collection as part of this 75th Memorial partnership with the state library system, and it has some really cool pictures on there. And when you were saying that you were looking for ideas and stuff, when I was looking through the pictures, so anybody that's goes to our website and follows the links to the 75th Commemorative Committee can go and look at those curated things. And one of the things they said was they encouraged everyone to dig bomb shelters. I had no idea about that. And then they said they had this outbreak of dengue fever. And then they have all these pictures of them spraying the area for mosquitoes because all these bomb shelters filled up with water. You know, it was so interesting. So there's little ideas and interesting factoids and all over the place.
And I think a lot of people said they were full of buffos as well. So I have a scene in my book with the women at Fort Shafter in an air raid shelter. Yeah.
That was so fun. Well, what are some of your favorite facts that maybe you discovered in your research that you may or may not have put into any of your books? What are some of those things? Can you think of any of them?
Um, Well, I think one thing that I always found interesting because I love the volcano is that in early 1942, the volcano or Mauna Loa erupted, and I just always found that the timing of that, here we are, the entire state blacked out, trying to hide from the Japanese ships and planes. And then suddenly the mountain is on fire, erupting. So I always just found that kind of fascinating, and also surprising when they decided to bomb it to try to stop the eruption, because I think it was headed towards Hilo at that point. So that was kind of an interesting fact. And also to me, just the volcano, because I've been up there enough to know that they had the Kilauea military camp was an internment camp for not too long, because they did send people to Oahu and the mainland, but I knew that it was an internment camp. I just didn't know how much of a hub the volcano was during the war, and that they had an airstrip, and that they were patrolling that whole coastline, looking for Japanese ships and submarines. And just I think it was the 27th Division, the National Guard that was up there. And what an important role, they were at Volcano House. And yeah, I just thought that was really fascinating.
So, as a parent, I'm always told that I'm not allowed to have favorites amongst my kids. So, but I am going to ask you, do you have a favorite character in your stories that you found that spoke to you, or because it seems like you have a repetitive type of character in Coco and Ella. I love those two characters. And I was wondering, do you have a favorite?
Well, it's funny you mentioned those two, because I think I end up really loving Ella and Coco, and I don't set out really knowing how they're going to be, their personalities. I just know a little bit. And then as I write them, then I kind of fall in love with them. I think Coco and Ella might be my favorite characters. And also it's funny because I have my main character, but oftentimes their friends I like just as much, or even almost more, like same as this book I'm writing now, it's her best friend that I'm like, wow, she's kind of the fun one, And then some kind of ancillary characters, I think, as well. In my first book, Island of Sweet Pies and Soldiers, I wrote about the old man Bernard Lalamilo in Waipio Valley, where they ended up staying. And for some reason, and then he showed up a little bit later as well. He became one of my favorite characters, just a fun side. So yeah, I think the kids, for some reason, they were easier to write as well. Yeah.
They just seem so real. I just really, I really enjoyed that aspect. Well, I've heard other authors talk about the fact that and something you mentioned is that the characters seem to introduce themselves to you while you're writing and kind of push their way into the story. So can you talk about that a little bit? Does that happen to you? And how does that work?
Well, it definitely happens because I don't always know, it's sort of like you just sit down and write every day or almost every day. And I have, a rough outline, but and I kind of know where the story's going, but not entirely when I start. And so as you're writing, it's like unspooling, a ball of yarn. You don't really know where you're going, and you have to take all the steps to get there. And so it's like, oh, they're walking into a store. Okay, well, I have to have a person working behind the counter, and oh, that person, oh, that's an interesting person, you know? So it's sort of like as the characters go through the world, they meet people. And then those people you bring, you know, you often draw from what you know in life. And so I think that's how it happens. Yeah. And then
So,
also writing dialogue. When you're writing dialogue, you start to kind of get to know them better, I think, too.
so the characters, their personalities you develop, but how do you find the historical facts about the people that to make it historical fiction? How do you do your research?
So I think I read a lot of books, you know, historic or fiction or nonfiction, just about the time period. And then I have my mom. I had my mom and my dad before he passed away, who were young, and then my uncle, a family friend, Marilyn Carl Smith, that grew up in Hilo. Spent a lot of time at Volcano. I interviewed a 90, I think she's 98-year-old woman now, who's from Hilo, and so a lot of that comes from talking to older people, you know, that were little during the war. Yeah. And then I watch, you know, it's hard because there's not a lot of movies or, you know, about documentaries about what I'm writing about per se. So I imagine a lot of the stuff also.
Yeah. Well, you said that you watch some movies and that you read books. Do you have a favorite book or books that you'd like to share with us?
Well, I do love The Secret Life of Bees. That's one of my favorite books. It just resonated with me. I love every character. I love just the setting. I'm really big on setting. I love to read about food, and I thought she did an excellent job with food, you know, Southern food. I also really loved Prodigal Summer by Barbara Kingsolver because I think the nature aspect, and she also just has such a great way with words. And I loved how she wound 3 stories together. And I think I stole from her a little bit how she has the beginning and the ending of her book, like a very short prologue and then a very, you know, a very short epilogue that were almost the same. So I stole a little bit from her in Red Sky Over Hawaii, just how she did that. And then recently I really loved Where the Crawdads Sing.
Yeah. Well, we had talked earlier about favorite books, and it's interesting how somebody will have a favorite book and then they'll read another one, and then you get a little bit anxious about having to kick one of your favorites off the list so you can make room for more because there's just so many awesome books out there. Now, you're a historical fiction author, but do you stick to just, obviously the 3 books you just mentioned weren't, but do you read a lot of historical fiction and to help you with your work or not?
I read a fair amount of it. I loved The Book Thief. I thought that was just an amazing book. I loved All the Light We Cannot See. I also I liked the Alice Network, you know, and so I read historical fiction. The Flight Girls by Noelle Salazar. I thought that was a fun, lighthearted historical fiction. And Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet, you know, another interment story. But I kind of read widely. I don't just stick to historical fiction. And as well, my first book, Island of Sweet Pies and Soldiers, is actually my 4th novel. So I have 3 books before that are not published, that are not historical fiction. They're all Hawaii. They're all similar feel, but just not present day. And then I have another one that I wrote before Red Sky Over Hawaii that's actually present day, but it takes place in the same house. And so I think I'll be done with either at 4 or 5 books, then I'm going to transfer out of historical fiction.
Well, for all those folks, not myself included, because I am a avid reader and not a writer, but how can you talk to us a little bit about your process of writing?
Sure. Yeah. Well, when I first began, I had been a teacher, and then I was in a transition period in my life. And so I just sat down one day, and I had more time suddenly. And I'd always wanted to write a book, and I just started writing. And so my first few books obviously needed a lot of work. And I went to writers' conferences, and I learned kind of the process and what worked for me. And so now when I write, I generally take about maybe 5 to 6 months on a first draft. Although this last one was longer because I think the pandemic, it was just hard to concentrate on anything. 5 or 6 months on a first draft, and then I go through a revision with my agent, and then a bigger revision with my editor. And then, I'm usually adding. Some authors are usually having to delete. I'm usually having to add. And having an editor really makes a huge difference in just taking the book, to another level. They make you go deeper. And if you're not really sure what to do, they always give great advice. So I always tell people, if you can, hire or use a good editor, if you can, get that.
So how do you feel about going and attending a writers' conference? Is that scary?
It was scary. The first time I went and read, it was like a first page workshop. So we all had to read our first pages, and this was my first book. And it was the first time I had read in public. And at that moment, I realized how awful my first page was. But you have to do that. You have to go through all of that, writing bad books until, to get to be able to write. And I learned a lot at the writers' conferences, made great contacts. And then the Mokuleia Writers Retreat is a really good one for Hawaii people, as well as Kauai Writers Conference. But Mokuleia, you're there for a week and you're actually writing. We had some great teachers, local teachers and mainland people as well. And so just a great group of people, great, just support. I don't think you can do it alone in a room, just sitting there. You need feedback, definitely.
Well, for in this time of COVID, when we're not going out, do you have any suggestions on books about writing that you could suggest? Like I'm not a writer, will never be, but I loved that Anne Lamott book, Bird by Bird.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you had any suggestions.
Well, that would be one of my top three. Bird by Bird. Of course, On Writing by Stephen King. And I loved Wired for Story by Lisa Crone. Wired for Story is essential. And Constance Hale, she's from Hawaii. Sin and Syntax is a great one, as well as what's the other one? Stein on Writing. Saul Stein on Writing. He's an editor, a famous editor. Those would be my picks.
So how do you go about finding an editor? If you do you like maybe contact somebody that has written a book that you like and say, hey, who was your editor? Or how do you do that?
Well, at the Mokuleia Writers Retreat, the woman who runs it, Connie Hale, she is part of the San Francisco Writers Grotto. And so I think I asked her, because she's an editor as well. She gave me a name. But you can also, there's a bunch online, and you just want to make sure to kind of look at their bio or look at, people that they've worked with, so they're reputable. And yeah.
Cool. Well, I was looking to see if we have any more questions from our chat. Doesn't look like anybody has any questions, probably because they've just been so interested in what you have to say. They're just enjoying your talk. I'm trying to think of some. I haven't finished. Like I said, I just started a lieutenant's nurse, and I'm really looking forward to reading that. But I was a little nervous about it, so I was hoping you could set me straight a little bit. It's set in the hospital, but Do we encounter a lot of the wounded in this one?
I think, I don't read my reviews. I try not to, but I usually end up reading a couple in the beginning. And I know that a few people did say that there is, there's a little bit of gore. I don't think I focused on it, but it is in the hospital. It is about nurses at Tripler. So there is a little bit, yes, a little bit of blood and, injuries, people, some death and dying.
Yeah.
But I tried not to get too gory with it. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like that makes it real.
Yeah.
If it
Exactly.
doesn't seem real, then it's not, you don't get invested in the story. And
Right.
I think that's another thing about your books that I found so interesting is that even though it is set in a time of war, the characters have problems and issues that are not necessarily about the war. And their personality issues or their things that are happening in their life that make them seem so real to me and engaging to the reader, but without everything being about the one thing, which is, World War II. There's, just like in this time of COVID, we have everybody has other problems too going on in their life. It's not just all COVID. There's other things going on. And that's what I liked about your books is other things are going on as well, and I thought that was very, very interesting. How do you balance the good and bad when you're writing? How do you make it not be too realistic, but not be too sweetsy? Because these are romances and I'm not a romance reader, but I completely enjoyed them. Really.
Thank you. Yeah, I've had some people say that. I don't read romance, but I liked your books. I like to think of them as love stories. And just because everybody loves, love is an important part of our lives. And it just because we're at war, that didn't go away, and people's hearts were being broken all the time. And I wanted to portray that. And, like I said, so my grandmother, when she was always, telling us the stories about the war, so as dark as a time it was also very, there was always a sense of nostalgia, for these people. Like there was a lot of good things as well, all these relationships that they formed, these bonds that they formed, things happening that were also good and memorable. Just everything was heightened, I think. And what's really important in your life becomes more prominent. I think now we can relate to that in the time of COVID, like what's really important, I think it becomes crystal clear during times of crisis. And so I kind of wanted to portray that as opposed to just the battle and the war scenes.
Yeah. Well, did an excellent job. Well, we have a comment over here from Nicholas McGuire, and it says, I disagree. Your medical authenticity was great and very interesting. So that's a ringing endorsement for the lieutenant's nurse. So,
well, I found a really excellent book by a doctor who had, it was like, I think it was called Desperate Surgery in the Pacific. And it was very helpful. Some of these very niche books that probably don't, they're not wide national bestsellers, but they are so amazing and important books, so I was really happy that I found that book that also talked about the anesthesia. I'm not sure how far you got into it, but covers the whole anesthesia kind of debate on what kind of anesthesia to use on these patients. Yeah.
So interesting. So how on earth did you find that book?
Well, that was, I looking online. Yeah.
That sounds a definitely niche book.
Yeah. Another book, Joe Rochfort's War. I got at the Pearl Harbor bookstore, and that is an amazing book on just, it's about the code breakers in the dungeon particularly, but it's just this amazingly well-researched book, just kind of on Pearl Harbor. Yeah.
Oh, that sounds great. Well, would you have any advice for anybody that let me go over the list you mentioned again about some of the other, if you liked your books. We've got The Corner Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet by Jamie Ford, Flight Girls by Noelle Salazar, The Last Year of the War by Susan Messier. Messin, is that how you say her name?
Meissner, maybe.
Meissner, okay. And The Jane Austen Society by Natalie Jenner, and Tuscan Girl by Angelica Petch. And then you mentioned earlier that The Paris Library by Charles, I'm not sure how to say his last name here.
Oh no, it's
Uh,
by a woman.
oh, it's by a woman. I got the wrong one. So, yeah, so you said you haven't had a chance to read that one. It's, I guess,
Oh,
not.
that was supposed to come out this summer, but because of COVID, it was one of the books that got pushed back. I think,
Okay, that's why.
but it just sounds so fascinating to me.
Yeah. Well, I had a suggestion too, one called Dangerous Act of Kindness by L.P. Ferguson. And that's about a pilot in England and this dangerous act of kindness that a English farmer's wife helped pilot. And what made me think about that book is that you have a lot of acts of kindness in your books. In so many ways, the mother's kindness to her daughter, the women's kindness to each other, just so many different acts of kindness. And I just really appreciate that about the books too. So,
Thank you.
oh, and here's another thing, Malia Kressler. I love your books so much and hope to meet you someday. You're such an inspiration. I love the character of Mr. Can I spell this? It's Makadangdang.
Mr. Makadang Dang.
Yeah. And what was your inspiration for him? She's asking.
You know, I've always loved that last name. I had a vice principal with that last name that I worked with. And it rolls off your tongue so fabulously. And so I've used that last name in a couple of my books. I love names. And so that was a fun one. Yeah.
Can you say it again?
Makadang Dang.
Makadang. Yeah.
It's a great name. And I was happy they let me keep that on my first line in my first book.
Oh, cool. And then Marilyn Barbosa says, wasn't there one called Summer of My German Soldier? Oh, she's asking about yeah. And I think that was I don't remember the author, but I think that was a book from quite a while ago. And yeah, there's a lot of great World War II fiction and historical fiction. I mean, you could spend a whole lifetime reading it. That's just wonderful. Did Beneath the Scarlet Sky, that's a fairly recent one. I forget the author, but that was a really interesting book. There's so many awesome ones.
There are so many.
Yeah.
I once did I think I asked people on one of my posts, like on Facebook, what was your favorite historical fiction novel? I compiled a very long list of it, and I have it somewhere on my computer. I need to pull it up. But you said I could spend my whole life reading them.
Yeah. And are you on Goodreads?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Goodreads is a fun place to do that too and see what other people are reading. And yeah. And of course, there's always the library. You could call the library and talk to a librarian.
I know.
And see what they have to say.
I'm excited to head on to Kahuku and Wailua Library now that I'm here on shore.
Yeah, you can go to curbside and pick up some of these books we talked about and maybe get a few other ones you hadn't heard of. So, well, I really appreciate you taking the time. I understand you just moved. So fitting us in to your busy schedule, COVID or not, whether you're home or not, people are still busy. So we really appreciate you joining us tonight.
No, I was very honored to be asked because this what is it, the 75th commemoration celebration. It's important, and I'm really happy that they're still going through, with honoring these people. And so I was very honored to be part of it. Thank you.
Yeah, so take a look if you can at some of the activities on the curated digital collection. You might find some inspiration for your sixth book.
Definitely.
Even though I know you said you were going to branch out to some others, but
yes, I have a few sequels planned to Red Sky Over Hawaii.
oh, fantastic. That's awesome. All righty. Well, I was just wondering if anybody else has any final questions before we wrap up our conversation today. And also remind everybody about the Facebook event at 10 o'clock this Saturday, Aloha Rodeo. And that'd be fun. I think you would really enjoy that too, Sarah. Yeah. So, and I guess that's all we have. We have a few minutes left, though. I just wanted to share something for a minute that has nothing to do with your books, but I just thought it was so interesting. I was listening to a podcast this morning, and the interview, it was the Tim Ferriss show, and the person he was interviewing is Hugh Jackman. And he started talking about this book he was reading, and he could not stop talking about it. It was really sweet and endearing, but it's the Richard Powers book, The Overstory. That's why I had asked you if you had read that one. You never know who's a reader and who's not, and what book will tickle their fancy, because I just can't see Wolverine with his claws, reading a book about trees, which is The Overstory is all about trees. And I thought that was interesting. So
it's an amazing book. And it's true, that's why I don't read reviews, is because I get people that just love my book, and then there are other people that just don't love it, and with all books, I find it quite fascinating, actually, the subjectivity
yeah. Yeah. So when people talk about their favorite books, I always love to ask people what their favorite books are, because you think you're going to find something out about the person. Not so much, because you have no idea. Actually, recently, well, I always call Barbara Kingsolver Barbara my friend, because I love every single thing she's written. I just think she's just awesome. But I'm in love with the book The Goldfinch, and I've read it like 3 times. And if you ask people, either they hate it or they love it. The movie I hated, because I don't think they did it justice. So be careful who you get to your movie when your book goes made into a movie.
Definitely.
But I hope people don't, people are going to think, that Goldfinch, that woman is odd. Well, that's okay, because you never know what it is about a book that makes it a person's favorite. So
yeah, it's that emotional resonance that you really can't put to words.
Yeah. So it says here, do you read books then? Oh, okay. So Marilyn again is asking, do you read books and then watch the movie? What about you? Which do you do first? Do you read the book and then watch the movie, or watch the movie and then read the book?
I generally always like the book a lot better. And so I always try to read the book first, because I know either way I'm going to be disappointed. But one book that I did actually like the movie better was Into the Wild by, I think,
Krakauer. Oh.
I thought that movie was just so beautiful, and the music was, for some reason, I liked the movie better. I think that's the only movie I've liked better than the book.
That was a good visual. Well, I think a movie that the movie was as good as the book, which I find not very common, is the movie, the Cowie Hart Hemmings book, The Descendants. Mm-hmm. I thought the movie was fabulous. I loved the book, and I thought the movie was so well done.
That movie was well done, definitely.
Yeah. That's another Hawaii, a local girl. See, your book could be fun. We'll all make a group trip and we'll all go see a movie together that when your book.
Well, my dream in life is to see one of my books at the Honokaa Theater. I love going to the Honokaa Theater. You know, it's old. It was there back in the day, and you hear the Koki frogs almost louder than the sound system. It's still such a wonderful experience.
Well, they'll issue the headsets for hearing assisted. You know, we can all wear those while we're watching your movie there at the theater. So thank you again, Sara, for joining us tonight. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I really encourage anybody that's interested to go check out the 75th anniversary commemorative committee website, and you can get to it from the HSPLS website. So thank you.
All right. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.